Thank you, Louise, and thank you everyone for coming. It's great to speak to you again. I think this might be my 5th or 6th time doing this over the years, and in different venues, and it's lovely to speak to you and to see you, and I am here. And in the question period, I imagine we might have a few things to talk about Canadian-American relations. But if you'd like to ask questions about the museum as well, I don't have a great filter, so I often overshare on things. So if you're interested in future exhibitions or things that are happening here, feel free to take the opportunity, and we'll see what I can talk about. The Friends have, over the years, many years, been a key component to the success here of the Canadian War Museum. And one of the interesting things I've been working on and off, largely off the side of my desk, is the history of the Canadian War Museum, and looking at that and the surprising and influential work of the Friends from the late 1980s, in that period when the Canadian War Museum at the old building was really being strangled of resources and funds. The fight for a proper museum that emerged after the Holocaust gallery scandal in 1997 and 98. And really the key role that you have done for us in fundraising, in raising our profile, and in amplifying voices. So thank you very much to all of you, and to those who, I don't know which camera I'm looking at, who may be out there at some point who see this down the line. So this book is my 19th book, 19th edited or written book. And it's sometimes interesting when you have an author in front of you to hear a little bit as to what motivated to write the book. There's lots of books you can write. Someone asked me a couple books back, geez, I thought you would have run out of topics by now. And at one point I thought that might be the case for the Great War, which is really where I started. And but there's always something interesting, there's always something new, there are new questions. And to be brutally honest, this book came out of a couple of motivations. One of them was that I was looking to do a book that was about Canada and the United States. So I was exploring the time period of the Civil War, which I find fascinating, and which we're doing an exhibition on next, not this summer coming up, but the summer after that. But for a number of reasons, I shifted towards this book on the Second World War. And it emerged really from two areas. One was I visited the World War II Museum in New Orleans. It's a fabulous museum. That's the one that Spielberg and Tom Hanks are associated with. And it's really just a fine museum, almost encyclopedic in its coverage, except of course, there are 2 references to Canada in the entire museum that I found. And one of them is a D-Day map with the British flag over Canada. Now, fair enough, that was our flag, but thought, okay. I left there thinking, bully that. Who do I write to? That kind of thing. And then, well, geez, who do I write to? I should write to myself. I should write something. I don't expect the Americans to know our history. And as you know, when the Americans are talking about World War II, they're playing for keeps, right? That's a war that propels them forward to superpower status. That's a war that is tremendously important in the social memory there, and the greatest generation and all of that. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll come back and write something at some point. And the second thing was the first Trump administration and the slapping of tariffs on our steel and softwood and things like that. I thought, geez, that's not how you treat an ally. That's an important ally. But, thank goodness he's gone. History has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? So I wrote the book, and I knew that it would come out in September of 2024, which it did. And I didn't think it was going to come out to influence the election, but I did want it to come out so that our friends in the United States understood the contribution from Canada during the Second World War, as we call it, or World War II, as they call it, that war which they often see as starting in 1941. And of course, we have a different start date. So, a lot of motivations there. We can come back to any of that if you'd like throughout. That idea of World War II or Second World War, I think, is interesting. And it's just one of the very small differences between the two countries when we talk about the war against the Nazis and the fascists. There are many more commonalities and partnerships and that really important alliance. And those of you who have had a chance to look at the book, the back, the bibliography, the footnotes, I've read a lot of books on alliance warfare and the key role of the United States in shaping that alliance. And consistently, over and over again, Canada just gets left out. We're just not there. We're not there for the Second World War. We're not really considered in the Cold War. And a whole slate of alliance books have come out recently, provoked by Trump and his talk of pulling out of NATO or threatening there. And Canada's not mentioned in any of those books. So it's a continuing trend, which I think you are a group that has a lot of experience. Maybe in the question period, we might talk a bit about that. Nonetheless, this war, the Second World War, as I will call it, is a key turning point in the relationship between Canada and the United States. It's fundamental to understanding the two countries, and the fact that Canada paid a terrible price in that war, 45,000 dead, as you know, 55,000 wounded, does not register in the United States. And in fact, I've had many conversations with learned scholars who are aware, of course, that Canada served in the war, but not the extent of our commitment. Dieppe and D-Day tend to dominate with very little understanding of our role in the Battle of the Atlantic or in multiple air campaigns, and almost nothing about the home front. And those of you who know some of my books know that I too often write about the men and women who serve in times of war and use the letters and diaries and memoirs. I've spoken to veterans for the last 25, 30 years. That is important to understand, that fighting experience of how soldiers cope and endure, how they kill and how they are killed, what happens to them after war. And here, of course, soldiers shorthand for service personnel. So this book is a little different insofar as looking at, I would argue, most of the books about Canada in the Second World War look outwards, do a transatlantic scope, and that's the view, right? Canada and Britain, for the most part. It's a very different view when you look southward or northward, over the border, over the 49th. You get a very different perception of the war experience. And that's one of the things that attracted me to the topic. Although, again, if I go back to pulling back the curtain, this was a scary book to write. When I began to formulate it, I thought at first it would be a diplomatic political history, so between King and Roosevelt. And I found that too much had been written on that. So then I realized there really isn't a good book on Second World War Canadian wartime production. Maybe that's what the book should be about. So I did all kinds of research there. And then I kept thinking, oh my goodness, how Canada and the United States defended North America is almost completely underexplored in the literature. How did we defend the East Coast and the West Coast? Thinking about the North. And it kept rolling and rolling and rolling. And so it's all of those topics in what is a pretty big book. Now, how we defended the Northern Hemisphere and North America, I would argue to you, is critical to understanding what we do during the war and our ability to project force beyond our borders. So the ability to send expeditionary forces abroad, right? 5 infantry divisions, 2 armored brigades, a very powerful navy, a significant air force. It would have been much more difficult to send those forces abroad if North America was imperiled. And that's just something we assume, that somehow we have this base. But how we went about doing that is not an easy thing, and it's something that I write about in the book. It also needs to be said, I suppose, that for much of our history between Canada and the United States, we were not good neighbors, right? We're a history that is plagued by wars and conflict and aggression through the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. But that changes. You know, the Battle of Queenston Heights and others like it are long in the past by the beginning of the 20th century, where through cautious diplomacy, entwined trade, and growing friendship, we begin to see the two countries coming together. And yet, I think I enjoyed reading and studying the invasion plans for each country from the 1920s, which is worth remembering. And, as a digression, I would say, I've had two conversations recently with one journalist who wanted to talk about this invasion plan and who said, is it possible that the US could invade us? And some very smart other people who were very concerned about Trump's recent comments. And at first I just said, well, no, it's not possible. Okay, why is it not possible? Well, it's just, it goes against what Western democracies do. It would be insane in terms of destroying economies. But why? And, that's not what the journalist said. They just kind of accepted my answer. But, we are entwined by culture and intermarriage and everything else. And I don't want you to think for 1 second, I think the United States is going to invade us. I don't. But it's this talk from Trump, which I will come back to, has worried people in many, many ways. And if it's not a military invasion, it certainly seems to be on the horizon economic warfare of the type that you do not inflict on close allies. But I will come back to that. But these plans, I think, are interesting. Canada's plan, Defence Plan Number 1, forged in the 1920s, involved, somewhat fancifully, an invasion into the United States, so crossing over from various military districts to capture key cities and infrastructure, to hold them and to engage in a fighting retreat, waiting for the Royal Navy to cross the Atlantic to destroy American cities on the East Coast. And possibly, it would appear, an invitation to the Australians to launch an expeditionary force against the California. I suppose it's not the worst plan, except that we didn't have any fighting forces to do this, even armored forces or anything else. So that's a drawback. The Americans had also an effective plan, and these are not the actual plans here, these are drawings of them, right? But the American plan was to capture Vancouver and Victoria very quickly, to take Halifax, our key port, by dousing it in chemical weapons dispersed from aircraft, taking Winnipeg, and then marching on Ottawa.
What year was that?
The American plan is active up until the mid-1930s.
But not during winter.
Sorry? But not during winter. Well, that's right. You may remember Pearson when he was prime minister. There was a lot of fear that the Soviets were going to land in the Arctic. And he was like, oh, Jesus, let them. Good luck to them up there. And that's worth keeping in mind. Our greatest shield has been geography. But our second greatest shield probably is our weather. And one might look to a parallel northern nation also threatening us in the Arctic at the moment, which has relied on generals winter and geography to protect themselves. So these plans are in effect, but really, it has been argued in the literature, really two ways. One, this is what militaries have to do. They're professional forces. You need to plan for the inevitable. Sorry, not the inevitable, the worst case scenario. The other option is, it's an indication of that relationship, fairly fraught still, coming through the First World War in the 1920s. But by the 1930s, these are largely shelved. In fact, there are the two countries sharing a 9,000 kilometer border. We're very accommodating and generous to each other in matters of trade and politics and defense. And much of this relationship before the war And during it, as a result of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King on the left and President Franklin Roosevelt on the right. And their relationship is an important one. And history can be a good guide, right? We've seen those relationships in our history between leaders when things have gone really well. Think of Mulrooney and Reagan. Then think of the opposite case, Diefenbaker and Kennedy, right? Which was a pretty significant low point. One would probably add to that Trump and Trudeau as a low point as well. These relationships matter, and it certainly mattered during the Second World War, where Mackenzie King made it his mission to be close to President Roosevelt, the most powerful man in the world, and he was able to do that. And Mackenzie King is not my favorite historical actor. He's a strange, sad old man. Those of you, you're all aware of his proclivities for seances and spiritualism and to take guidance from the spiritual realm. And yet that's one side of him, right? This waffling old man. The other side is our longest-serving prime minister in the British Empire. He was a canny political operator. He surrounded himself with very good ministers. And you don't win election after election by being weak and weird. So there's two sides to Mackenzie King. And during the course of my research, I found King a better leader. When looking at that relationship north-south, he does an awful lot in the early part of the war to strengthen Canada with the United States. He always pales in comparison to Churchill and Roosevelt. There's no doubt about that. He paled in comparison during the war years. A lot of painful accounts in King's diary, of which I've read thousands of pages, where he laments his own failure to be a charismatic speaker and to inspire people to greater heights, the way Churchill could or Roosevelt could. And yet he was our leader. And he was an effective administrator. And we can come back to King if you'd like at the end. But King and Roosevelt do play a key role. And part of that was on Roosevelt. He wanted and understood, even though his administration in the White House didn't really acknowledge this, that they needed to have Canada as a strong country on the northern border. Right? They were focusing a lot on Latin America, the Good Neighbors policy. They're focusing a lot on, of course, Nazi Germany from 1933 and Mussolini and his fascists and Japan's war in China and the Spanish Civil War and other elements. So this is a friendship, surprising as it might be, that goes both ways and benefits both countries. And this cartoon, I think, nicely captures it. Two kinds of frontiers. Right? There you see the friendly King and Roosevelt shaking hands. And then down here, any other European frontier. Right? This is late 1930. This is 37, I think. And 38, sorry. The world is moving towards war. And yet the North Americans have figured out a way not to engage in aggression. And I think this is important. We also have to say, and it shouldn't surprise us, but both King and Roosevelt were hardcore appeasers. They did not want war. They were willing to sacrifice other countries for that. Both had lived through the First World War and the scarring effects of that, including the terrible casualties. And interestingly, in 1937, King goes to Berlin and meets Hitler. And he goes there to try to talk to Hitler as a leader, to talk him out of his aggression. And he's warned off this by many advisors. Say, don't go, he will charm you, he is not to be trusted. And yet King felt that as a man of peace, he should go there. And reading his diary entry for that period is agonizing. He talks about Hitler with his beautiful blue eyes, and this is a man of peace who's trying to lead his country, and he has to rectify some things in the past, but really, we both love our mothers, and I don't think he's going to take the country to war. So it's a really painful thing to read, and a terrible misjudgment on King's part. But to be fair, most people misjudged Hitler and his desire for war. I throw the image here on the left is quite interesting. It's a signed copy from Hitler to Mackenzie King. It's in his archives at the National Archives. But I put in the image on the right too, that there's King not giving the Nazi salute, and I think understanding why he should not. So both Canada and the United States fervently hoping for peace and largely protected by geography, our greatest shield. We were very far from the marching forces of Nazi Germany, and especially very far when Hitler orders the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, which drags Britain and France into the war. And the question then is, what will Canada do? You will remember, of course, we had control over our foreign policy. We were automatically at war in the First World War, on the 4th of August 1914, but now we will decide. Now, to be fair, there really wasn't much of a debate in the House of Commons. If you look at the Hansard, it's quite interesting, the language they use. We were almost always going to go to war and stand at Britain's side, but there are some interesting questions, and I write them into the book, especially by French Canadians in the Liberal Party who say, why would we go to war? It's so far, it's not our war. And look at the United States, they are neutral. Shouldn't we be neutral? No, we were not going to be neutral. It would be our war. And we looked to the United States and wondered what the Americans would do. Of course, Roosevelt kept his country out of the war. But going through the Roosevelt papers, it was fascinating to find one survey that found that only 2.5% of Americans believe they should go to war. That's not 25%, that's 2.3% of Americans. So Roosevelt understood his country. And I should point out, this was a surprising statistic I found. The US military had been deeply weakened and withered by the Depression, just as Canada's military forces had been starved. It was only the 19th largest army in the world. Yeah, so they weren't ready to go to war in any sense. And yet there was great disappointment, especially Mackenzie King. It's really fascinating to read his diary where he comes out full throttle, angry against Roosevelt. And yet he begins to work with the administration, and there's that period where we're deciding to go to war, where the Americans fly a number of planes to the northern border and pull them across because of neutrality laws, and they send us old First World War tanks, of which we have one example in Le Breton from this time period when they come up in 1940. And without a doubt, even though there were neutrality laws constraining the United States, they were very much supporting Canada all during this period. Not initially with military forces, but supplying us things like tools and machinery and expertise to help our wartime industry begin to kick off the rust, I guess, of the Depression years. But for both countries, everything changes with the fall of France. This is catastrophic, of course. And in fact, Henry Stimson, who's the American Secretary of the War, called France's defeat the most shocking single event of the war. It's surprising if you think of Pearl Harbor or other shocking events in the war. But why was that? Because everyone expected France and Britain to be able to fight on for 4 years, to allow the North Americans to build up their armed forces and then to decide what to do. So this changes everything with the fall of France. And certainly in Canada, with the NRMA Act and others, we begin to mobilize our wartime industry more effectively. We raise a 2nd and 3rd division, which happens a little bit before, but also after. And yet, the cartoon on the right, I think, nicely captures it. We are not ready for this war that will come. And this is the period where Canada, out of its own weakness, really is forced to turn to the United States, to stand against Hitler, who reigns supreme in Western Europe, and with Britain under such a tremendous threat in that summer of 1940, having pulled off a large number of its fighting forces from Dunkirk, but left behind much of its material and artillery and trucks and weapons. And so they need to be rearmed, and Canada will play a key role in that. And in the book, I talk a little bit about Canada's wartime strategy. And that's an interesting term because a lot of people never want to engage with that. Like, did we have a strategy in the war? We send a lot of soldiers abroad, but we have a number of strategies that changed during the course of the war, and I talk about them in the book. But one of the key ones, of course, is that we want to keep Britain in the war. That's absolutely crucial. Those ties to the British people, to the monarchy, to Western liberal democracy. But to do that, to supply Britain with industry, men, and money, we need to lean into the United States. So there's an irony there, I think, that I play around with in the book that other historians have not written about. My friend Jack Granatstein wrote a critical book which is called How Britain's Weakness Forced Canada into the Arms of the US, or something like that. And Jack is the greatest historian this country's ever produced. His argument is correct, but it's not quite right. I would argue it's Britain's weakness forces Canada to willingly embrace and lean into the United States to support Britain. So there's a triangle there that we should acknowledge. And King and Roosevelt continue to play a key role there. I won't go into all the details, but there are key security pacts, things like the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, who invited me to address their organization. They're still around today, established in August 1940. They were having a meeting here in Ottawa, something like their 227th meeting or something, and I had a very nice opportunity to meet both very senior American service personnel and diplomats who were working with our senior military personnel and diplomats. And that's a body that continues and emerged from the Second World War. The financial aspect is more important because the United States really contributes to Canada's rearming. And I quite like the cartoon on the right, Our Job Now. This is Canada, the young Canada, picking up this big log. I guess that's how you show that we're working hard. But that's Britain in the front, old man Britain and young Canada there. But to do that, we need that American support. And we get it. The intertwined automobile industry very quickly gets transformed into producing ships and trucks and hundreds of millions of shells, and I'll talk a bit more about the financial elements. But those trucks are, of which we have a CMP pattern in the Second World War, those are a significant contribution. We produce 850,000 of those vehicles. Monty's 8th Army in the Desert War, late 1942, half of the 8th Army is using Canadian vehicles. Good number of Rommel, too, since he captured so many from the British. But, this is a significant contribution that we don't acknowledge in Canada, and nowhere else in the world do they acknowledge this contribution from Canada. And it's, we couldn't have done it without the Americans, and I'm just keeping my eye on the clock. There's a great book for sale if you want to find out a little more, in a little more detail, and libraries have it as well. But our wartime industry is a significant contribution. We couldn't have done it without the Americans agreeing through Hyde Park Agreement and others to buy the same amount of our material as we were buying from them. And I think we just kind of assume that's going to happen, but imagine a different president, one who wanted to squeeze the Canadians, as the Americans were squeezing the British, as they were supporting them, but squeezing them of their wealth and gold reserves. That didn't happen with Canada. It would have been a very different war effort if the Americans treated us more aggressively, or even as a neutral country, as we technically were. They didn't, and that support allows us to have about 2 million Canadians working in wartime industry. If we think of the 1.1 million Canadians who serve in the armed forces, that's 3 million there. There's another million Canadians involved in secondary wartime work. That's 4 million. It's why your parents and grandparents were all involved in this war effort in some capacity. It's why we were involved in a total war effort. And then you layer in the kids and others who were involved in that war effort. And again, without slipping into accountant mode, I think it's just crucial to think about what we produce. 410 merchant ships, similar in size to the 2,710 American-produced Liberty ships. They're huge vessels, 134 meters long, huge cargoes, to carry the supplies across the Atlantic. We produce 16,400 aircraft, including about 1,500 for the US Navy, Curtiss Helldivers and Catalina flying boats. We produce 315,000 machine guns, almost 1 million rifles, several hundred million shells. The list goes on, sextants and other things. This is a significant contribution. If we sent not a single soldier abroad, this would still be a significant contribution to the Allied war effort. Now, maybe to pivot from this wartime production to the defense of North America, that too, I would argue, is not well understood by Canadians or Americans. And one interesting place to start, perhaps, is in the North, because the Americans wanted to build the Alaska Highway. They had wanted to do that before the war. We had denied them that, partially because on the map it looks like it divides Canada in two, and that's a dangerous thing. But the questions of sovereignty, I think, are really interesting, and how we deal with the Americans on the two coasts, but in the North as well. And the building of the Alaska Highway after Pearl Harbor, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, is an incredible engineering feat by the Americans. And yet it's through Canada's north. And so we have to negotiate how this is going to work, especially when there are 30,000 American soldiers and civilians in the Canadian north, far outnumbering the Canadians who live there. And it becomes more serious when the US Army begins to answer the phone, "Hello, Army of Occupation," in a kind of cheeky manner, right? That doesn't go over too well in Ottawa. But we figure out how to do that. In a Canadian way, we send one colonel flying around in a small plane who keeps landing in American camps, showing literally the Canadian flag, and then flying off to the next place. Now, the Americans, for their part, were not interested in occupying Canada's north. And the Alaska Highway, which is a tremendous legacy from the war, is pretty useless, actually, in supporting Americans in Alaska. And the isolation of Alaska is a great fear of the United States. What that road might have done, but which was done instead by aircraft, was to supply the Soviet Union. So when Hitler turns on his good buddy Stalin in June of 1941, the war changes again, with the Soviet Union becoming our very strange ally. And there's a great film, Our Northern Neighbor. There's a couple films about the Russians and how we helped them during the war, made by the NFB, which are great historical documents to see. But one of the ways that we assist the Russians, in addition to sending something like $150 million worth of aid to Russia, that's Canada, is a coordinated air route called the Northwest Staging Route, where we eventually fly about 8,000 aircraft from the United States and Canada up to Alaska, where Soviet pilots are waiting, and then they fly them over almost to the battlefront. And this is a significant contribution. A lot of them go through Edmonton, which becomes our biggest air hub. And the Americans pour in millions there to help develop that, as well as all these other airfields that are dotting the north as the key sort of strategic logistics. They too, after the war, will be a part of our transportation network. And they, along with the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, another major contribution from Canada, are ways to, again, reflect on Canada's contribution in the war. There are a number of monuments and statues in Fairbanks, Alaska, and Nome to that Northwest staging route. Americans call it something different. They make no mention of Canada. So if the North was active, the supplying of material to the South is absolutely frenzied. And we are, of course, a mineral power. And that's worth thinking about. Our most important products, aluminum, nickel, hydroelectricity. Just think of aluminum. We produce 3.6 billion pounds of it. A third of that goes to the US. A lot of it goes into our industry. That's what you need for aircraft, right? The nickel is important. Everybody needs Canadian nickel. We power much of northern New York State, wartime industry, with hydro. It's cut off a little bit there. The poster says, this is our strength. I find it really interesting as we are mobilizing our arguments and resources again for Trump, how people are focusing again on strategic mineral reserves. The US needs Canada in this area. They needed us during World War II. They need us today. And a friend of mine, Norman Hilmer, fabulous professor at Carleton, has forgotten more about Canada and the United States than I will ever know, said, Tim, he read through the manuscript at one point. It's a good manuscript. Here's a point to keep in mind. The Americans only pay attention to us when they need us. You're talking about a time when they needed us. There are other points in our history when they need us. But don't think that that relationship is an easy one. You got to work at it. And you see that on the diplomatic front and many other fronts during the war. But this I will draw attention to, and maybe we'll come back to this if you want to talk about maybe where the future lies. I'm going to finish up just the next 5 minutes or so, although I think that's under my 45 minutes, so I want that to be noted that I am sticking.
I'm very impressed.
You tell me how long and I will get there. So this defense of the Northern Hemisphere, I think is really important to understand. And I talk about it on the West Coast. Newfoundland is a fascinating story, a separate dominion, of course, and how the Rock becomes this great outpost and frontier. I talk about the Royal Canadian Navy, and isn't this an amazing photograph of the trials in the North Atlantic, both against the U-boats and against the weather. I talk about it in the book, and I've mentioned this to Americans. I've been on a bunch of podcasts. I'm not a great podcast listener, but apparently podcasts are everywhere, and I'm getting hooked a little bit. There's a couple I've been following. And so I've been sharing the word here, and I talk about the Royal Canadian Navy and the important contribution in helping the Americans in early 1942 when the U-boats were savaging American shipping off the East Coast. They sink about 200 ships because the Americans don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to sail in convoys. They have no proper protection. Their whole Navy is on the Pacific front, and they're dealing with the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. It's the Royal Canadian Navy that helps out the Americans through the Triangle Run from March of 1942. This, I think, is important. The war in the Pacific, I discussed that. The strange quirk of fate where Canada declared war on Japan before the United States did. Why? Because we had 2 battalions, right? Sea Force at the colony in Hong Kong that were fighting for their lives and eventually annihilated as a fighting force on Christmas Day, 1941. That group, by the way, is coming here to the museum, the Hong Kong Commemorative Veterans Association, on the 15th of August. So we've had occasional events, as you know, in our theater, and that's a group that we continue to work with, as we do with so many. The attack on Pearl Harbor demands and brings Canada into the war, fighting on both coasts. This is a great poster, I think, to remind Canada of the threat. And Mackenzie King, again, plays a key role here. Because remember when this is. It's early 1942. We're losing the battle of the Atlantic. Things are desperate on the East Coast. But King says we have to send warships to the West Coast. We have to send a division there to strengthen and to support our American friends. They need to know we are standing with them. We send 4 squadrons of the RCAF to Alaska. That's important. It's recognized. We send crucial anti-aircraft batteries. All of this, and there's tremendous fear in the United States and on the West Coast. And some of this, I write in the book, I try to explore and explain the gross infringement of civil liberties on Japanese Canadians. Right? We follow the elite of the Americans who imprisoned 120,000 Japanese Americans. We forcibly relocate, they're not imprisoned, we forcibly relocate the roughly 22,000 Japanese Canadians. You need to understand the fear that is so pervasive on the West Coast of invasion to help frame that. And when we talk, not me, when many people talk about the Japanese Canadian forced relocation, they do not acknowledge almost that there's this war on, that there is this fear of a Japanese invasion. And the Japanese are unstoppable in early 42, right? Midway is several months off. So this is context. It's important to talk about this, to understand, not to explain away, but to make sense of, I think. And I hope the book does that. And one of the elements is the unified hemispheric defense. When the Americans imprison Japanese Americans, Canada largely follows suit. Now, there is definitely racism involved here, and British Columbia representatives in the cabinet are pushing for this, but you may want to see how I tackle that element in the book. I talk about the Aleutian campaign, and I'm gonna work through this now pretty carefully and quickly. You know, Canada's defense of the Northern Hemisphere allows us to send the RCAF abroad, allows us to engage in multiple naval campaigns, so which is the most important is about the Atlantic. But I want to just focus maybe on 3 invasions, maybe it's 4 invasions, and a unit. The first invasion is the American invasion of North Africa, where Canadians do not fight in November of 42, right? November of 42, the Americans land. They need support. We send 17 corvettes to help the Americans. 16 are for Royal Canadian Navy, 1 is Royal Navy. We pull some of our best warships off the bow of the Atlantic to support the Americans in their landing in North Africa. We take the hit for our allies. Second invasion, Sicily, July 1943. We're there with the Americans. 3 American divisions on the right landing, 3 British divisions on the right, 3 Americans on the left, Canada going up the gut. 1st Canadian Division commanded by Major General Guy Simonds. And in a strange quirk of fate, if you know that campaign, Monty's army is stopped halfway up the East Coast. Patton goes the long way around, and it's Canada, 1st Division, that goes up the gut through the Badlands. It's interesting, this untried fighting division, and we do very well in Sicily, the tactical level. Another invasion, mainland Italy. Who's there? September of 1943, Americans, British, Canadians. A unit, 1st Special Service Force, right? Devil's Brigade. This interesting, unique unit of Canadians and Americans fighting together in international character. Some of you may remember the film from 1968, The Devil's Brigade. I've spoken to a few veterans. I think, Ed, you and I have talked about it once or twice in the past. You know, most of those veterans remember it differently because the Canadians are depicted as more British, and the British were spit and polish. And it's very clear from reading letters and diaries of the guys who served there that they were North Americans. They understood they were Canadian or American, but they learned to fight together. And anybody who has served together and been forged in combat, as they were through intense battle, will understand that. And the final invasion, D-Day, right? 2 British divisions, 2 American with a 3rd in reserve, 3rd Canadian Division landing on Juno Beach. We are there. We are there as an ally, an important ally, a junior ally. If you leave today thinking Canada won the war on its own, you'd be wrong, right? But nor should we be relegated to that 3rd, 4th, 5th tier status, especially if you look beyond our fighting forces contributions, which are significant. And more so if you think about Canada and the United States working together in the Northern Hemisphere. Working together in the Northern Hemisphere to allow us to fight abroad and ultimately to defeat that heinous empire of genocide and mass murder, the Third Reich. There are many lessons in this book, and I'm going to finish up here, I think. A lot of points I talk about that resonated with me as I was writing it, thinking about I wrote it in 2022, 2023, you sort of edit it throughout late 23 and parts of 24, and the book comes out. Sorry, I wrote it in 22, 23, edited it in 24. And it kept reverberating this contemporary world in which we live, more so now that the Trump administration is in something I did not anticipate. And I wondered if I had to change the title of the book, if I should call it The Sometimes Good Allies, The Cyclical Allies. I don't think so. I mean, the book is firmly set in 39 to 45. I think there are lessons here, though. And I've spoken to senior diplomats, and General Wayne Eyre, telling him about the book, and others who all thought there was tremendous value in reminding our American friends of the shared history. And in this war of utter necessity, I argue in the book, Canada came to realize that free riding was out. It had to dig deep and sacrifice, and we paid our way. Paid our way in treasure, in weapons, and in blood. That's an important lesson for Canadians to know. That's not the 2% discussion. That's a different discussion. But it is the same thing. There is a price to being a grown-up country. There is a price to being a consequential nation, of which we were during the Second World War, and in which you would have a harder time making that argument today, I suspect. I would also argue, though, there are lessons here for the Americans. They could not and cannot defend North America without us. Where would we have been during the war if we had been, to go back to that cartoon of King and Roosevelt, if in fact we had a very unstable border? If we had had to rush tens of thousands of soldiers to somehow guard this 9,000-kilometer border, it would have diminished the fighting effectiveness of both nations. That did not occur. Instead, we found ways to work together. It was not without its bruises. Canada often lost in some of the arguments it hoped to make with the White House, and I write about that in the book. And yet out of this comes a continued presence of defending North America together. Think of NORAD, right? We see this legacy still to this day. Think of Canada's involvement in NATO. Think of the multiple joint operations that have been conducted between the Canadians and Americans. When I was down in Washington, I asked one of the officers there, I said, how many Canadians serve with American forces? And she told me over 1,000. Surprised me. Well, many of them are in NORAD, but in many other organizations, units, deputy commanders, all the way down, if we think of the Devil's Brigade, where you had Canadian officers commanding American rank and file, and the opposite, true as well. Another lesson, I would argue, for the White House. It should remember that its complex network of alliances is not maintained out of charity. Instead, it represents a substantial multiplier of American power and a shield by which to protect the realm. Those alliance systems were critical to winning the Second World War, and they remained critical during the Cold War, and they are critical today. There are other legacies, but I think I will end it on this. This monument, this cross of sacrifice in Arlington National Cemetery, erected by Canada in 1927 to mark the perhaps 40,000 Americans who served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War, and which marks the 30,000 Americans I've uncovered who served with the Canadian forces in the Second World War. And of those 30,000, over 900 were killed wearing the Canadian uniform. Most of them Air Force, but a substantial number in the Army. Perhaps it's this cross of sacrifice that we should think about today, and how the North Americans came together and paid the price and fought to victory no matter the cost. And I would argue that now is the time in Ottawa and Washington to band closer together, to speak loudly of that shared history, and to remember that one's good allies of the past are those of the present and the future as well. Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to take any questions if you want to put your hand up and maybe identify yourself. Yeah.
Was there any relationship with Canada when Churchill was, I don't want to say the word badgering, but consistently asking Roosevelt for war reduction? Well, Britain was at its worst during that period.
Yeah, that period of 1940 and early 41, when you remember the Americans eventually bringing in Lend-Lease to allow the British basically to take their supplies and to pay for them later. And, they paid for them. It took them 50, 60 years to pay off that. That was what the British wanted the Canadians to do. And Churchill actually pressures King and says, you should take Lend-Lease. And King says, I can't. We will become indebted and too entwined with the United States. So King goes down there and gets a different deal, a much better deal, almost a free trade deal. We agree to buy as much from you as you will buy from us. That's a critical element. And I wonder what would have happened if we had taken a Lend-Lease type deal from the United States. Now we should keep in mind that Canada and the US, our wartime economies and trade become really entwined during the war. It's impossible to untangle them. And after the war, as I write in the book, there remains a complex challenge for Canada between heart and head. Our heart is still with the British Empire and Britain, at least in English Canada. But our head tells us we have to be in the North American economy. And it's certainly, with the world in ruins and Britain bankrupted, that is confirmed there. And we never come back from that. And people through the 60s and 70s argued we were too deeply entwined, or we went from being a colony to a nation briefly to a colony again, an American colony. Those are all interesting discussions to have. But it's hard to see how we could have done it any other way during the Second World War, when we were all in. Yes, sir.
I have a couple of things. One is modern Americans probably learned most of their Second World War history from Hollywood. And the second thing is, when you see or read about, in some cases, the war, Canadians are under a British flag. So is there an issue there about distinguishing between who's under that flag?
Yeah, both good questions. So I wrote a book called The Fight for History in 2020, which looked at our failure to tell our story and looked largely at the Second World War. It was a pretty significant book, I think, and I argued that we did a really piss-poor job in this country in talking about our contributions during the Second World War. We didn't create a space for veterans to talk about those experiences. We didn't build the same monuments. We didn't build a Vimy. We didn't have the same national monument. There's a fascinating discussion in the book about this national monument that was supposed to be built, never was. I won't go into that again, except we've done a better job recently. And yet, of course, it was during a time when so many of our veterans were passing away. So yes, that's partially on us as a people, as a society. There were reasons why we didn't do that, which I talked about in the book. Veterans often didn't want to talk about their experiences. They couldn't talk about it. We were moving forward into a period of tremendous prosperity. We weren't looking backwards. We'd never been very good in telling our own history. Hollywood smothers us, and you're exactly right. Where would we be if I used to teach at Carleton, and a lot of the kids knew a lot about World War II fighting, both from video games they were playing. Tim, can you tell me the firing cycle of the MG42 versus the Bren gun? Holy shit. You barely know who the good guys and the bad guys are, but so I eventually clued in. But the second thing there is that they had all seen Band of Brothers, and they'd all seen Saving Private Ryan, and I imagine other films too. And that has a tremendous impact. It really does. And Ed and I were once on stage talking about Paul Gross's Passchendaele film, and the success of it and the failures of it, and we came at it from a different point of view. But one thing I did think about that is, good on Paul Gross for having at least tried to make a film in Canada, because it's not easy to make films here. We might have all hoped for a maybe more historically accurate film, but there's a good story there. So anyways, that was one thing. And the flag is an interesting one. We had it, as well as I, we did fight under the British flag. We didn't have our flag until 65, 64? 65, yeah. February 15, 65. So how do you represent that in a museum? It's interesting. Do you stick to the historical time period? Do you think today? I'm not sure. I would prefer if at the World War II Museum they have us fighting under, the Red Ensign or the Union Jack, that they also had a Canadian maple leaf there, which might help. But maybe that's a challenge. It's one that museums grapple with. if you'll permit me a second or two, of how do you connect the past to the present? And how do you do it in a historically accurate way? There's a lot of talk about marginalized voices and diverse perspectives, and all that is important in the modern Canada. We're a different country. But it isn't always easy to map that onto the past or to map the past onto the present. And that's a struggle that many museums have in trying to depict some of that history. And the flag is just a tiny one, but it's a good one of an interesting discussion and debate. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
I just want to know, just moving to the future, or now, with the, what I call the orange waffle in the White House, and him trying to bring in minions, his own minions, into the Department of Defense, and including his own nominated Secretary of Defense. How do you think the NORAD and some of the boards and alliances we have with the Americans in the HQ and diplomats will fare?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll preface it by saying, as a historian, I'm more comfortable looking backwards than forwards. One of the things you see during World War II is that we throw everything at Washington, right? We send some of our best diplomats. Lester B. Pearson is our late war ambassador. We send Lieutenant General Maurice Pope, one of our finest generals. C.D. Howe sends down purchasing agents. We send a lot of people there. And you see that, that's kind of all, whatever we're calling it now, all of Canada approach. And we're doing that at the federal level, but also, most importantly, I would argue, at the provincial state level. And then there is the machinery that has been, largely uninterrupted, of the Canadian military personnel working with their American counterparts. And that is, there are countless boards and organizations and units there. So, could someone seriously dismantle that? I suspect not. Could someone shake some of it? Without a doubt. You could see if some of the most drastic, well, the tariffs is a very, very drastic, aggressive, near war-like, in my mind, activity. But pulling out of NATO would have devastating effects. I don't think NORAD is in any way, it doesn't make sense for the Americans not to want to be a part of NORAD, but
It doesn't make sense for tariffs.
it doesn't exactly. So logic is not always apparent in some of these discussions. Yeah.
Stephen Knowles. I'm always fascinated by one figure, and that figure, if I understand correctly, the Americans had roughly 300,000 dead. Are you familiar with that during the Second World War?
About 400,000, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
400,000.
415 or something.
10 times and they're 10 times our population.
Yeah.
We had 45,000.
Yes.
So if you look at it proportionally,
Yes.
we shed proportionally much more blood than they did.
You're right.
And all blood is important.
Yes.
But I think that's really, really important.
Yes.
Our contribution. Secondly, I was quite intrigued by your cover of the book. Maybe you address it in the book somewhere, but I looked at it. Was I looking at a Springfield rifle on the right with my dim eyes? Or?
Yeah. It's a special, they're part of the Devil's Brigade.
See all that closely? Okay.
Yeah, so they're First Special Service Force.
That's where that picture's from.
Yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
it's interesting, I think, in terms of Canadian and Americans serving together. It's better than some of the uglier, well, not uglier. Yeah. Anyways, yes, and you're exactly right. The proportional deaths. When I saw that, I did a double take. I thought, isn't that surprising? Again, keeping in mind that every loss is a loss, and the families and grieving next of kin. But proportionately, financially, we also support Britain at the end of the war with a loan that is larger than the Americans, proportionally again. Mm-hmm. So, some of that, it's when you talk about Canadian American, I think you don't want to fall into that special pleading kind of area. Like, I'll find every example where you can find a way to make it that we've done more than we have. But those are facts, so, they're important to say.
Well, in the First World War, they would have had 600,000 dead proportionally compared to us, for example. It's difficult to sometimes figure out the American. They have, I think, 115,000 dead in the First World War, only fighting from April, but so many of them are from the flu and other things. So without a doubt, I write that in the book, the point you make.
But I also say this is just one of many examples to think of Canada and our role in the war as consequential. Thank you.
I guess one last question.
Okay.
Mark Senecal, volunteer and interpreter here. By the way, I was one of those Canadians when I was serving in the Navy that was down under American command for 5 years. But my question relates to industrial production in the war. One of the things I haven't been able to find out, we talk about land lease. Did you get into lease land? I.e., how much did Canada provide to the U.S.? I know, for example, some of our Corvette production, not very much, but some of it went to the U.S. Navy in that terrible East Coast debacle in 42.
Right. So the question is, how much of our sort of war supplies were sent to the U.S.?
And how much did we help them?
No, I don't. I wasn't able to find a statistic on that.
Yeah.
Most of because we're largely producing British weapons, right? Lee Enfield Mark IV, Bren gun or Sten gun. Well, I don't know about Sten gun, but 25 pounder stuff. So that's naturally going to Britain. But some of those aircraft I talked about, that is one component. I think the far more important one are those natural resources, which really are significant. And again, remind me of how do you position Canada, maybe in the contemporary period, to remind the Americans of what they need us for. And without a doubt, it's still security of North America, and it's still our natural resources, oil, natural gas, uranium, aluminum, nickel, everything else, food. And I suppose one would say it's our place in the world with the Americans as a stable nation. And those arguments at the moment don't seem to be landing, but they are certainly being made by a lot of people at different levels. So we're going to see what the next couple of months hold. I hope it's only a few months, and we go from there. But I don't think it discounts the importance of talking about our history. I don't think any of this discounts what Canada did during the Second World War. Men and women who served in the armed forces and on the home front. And I think in 2025, I would still argue that there are a lot of Canadians who don't know this history. And I hope they have a better sense of it at some point as it emerges, perhaps through this fraught discussion, a discussion which, interestingly, I think has actually brought Canadians together in many ways, forced these discussions of what makes us Canadian and how should we do it and how dare they and all that kind of stuff. A little bit of rage goes a long way. So we'll get past that and then we'll come back to a good discussion, but maybe this shared history is just one of those very small stepping stones that we can use to talk about it. And someone could say, Cook, nobody cares about history. And I'd say, okay, fair enough. I don't think that's right, but fair enough. But imagine if we had no history. Imagine if we had none of this to build upon. Where would we be? So I think it's better to start with this relationship and go forward than to have nothing at all. Thanks very much, everyone.